This is the Latin News Podcast. My name is Richard McCall, your host here in Bogota, Colombia. This week, we're addressing an incredibly interesting topic. We'll be talking about China's growing influence in Latin America, and especially with regards to events taking place in November 2024. It's going to be, a landmark event and a cluster for news articles about China in this region around then. And I have with me here on the Latin News Podcast, Dr. Evan Ellis, who is the Latin American research professor at the U.S. Army War College. Dr. Evan Ellis, thank you so much for coming on the Latin News Podcast.
Thank you, Richard. It's a real pleasure to be on the podcast with you.
Well, no, the pleasure is ours because I can't think of anyone more qualified to discuss China's real inroads and on every different level. I mean, we hear about the Belt and Road project, we hear about the Global Security Initiative and so on, but it's more important than that, especially now with November coming up. So perhaps you could give us a little bit of a background to current date about China's policies towards Latin America, and then maybe we could plunge in and just say, what does China want?
It's a great question to start out with. And when I first started following China and Latin America in the early 2000s, a little over 20 years ago, the answer I came with then, even though China's style has evolved significantly and its footprint has evolved significantly, continues to be the same today, which is China first and foremost, in my judgment, wants its own economic benefit and to work towards a strong and secure and technologically sophisticated state. Now, what that means is that it allows its state-owned enterprises, its SOEs, to engage first kind of as its national champions to go after secure access to commodities and the foodstuffs that the Chinese people need. Also to go after markets, especially in strategic areas like electricity and digital technologies, as well as infrastructure projects. Now, in that process, the Chinese companies, with the help of the Chinese state, try to capture as much of the value added in those sectors as possible in terms of vertical and horizontal monopolies. But at the same time, there is a political dimension. I like to describe this political dimension as making the world safe for the continued rise of China. So a lot of times you see these Chinese initiatives to try to secure friendship or at least a lack of resistance, which is really aimed at getting China access to those things that it wants and at least no political opposition or alliances against it, for example, with the United States. Now, politically, there's also, of course, pressure with respect to the countries in the region. 7 of the remaining 12 countries that recognize Taiwan and not the PRC are there, of course, in Latin America and in the Caribbean. And there also is a military dimension to it, which is that, again, understanding that different Chinese bureaucracies look at the region in different ways. Ministry of Commerce versus the Ministry of Foreign Affairs from the perspective of the People's Liberation Army. And again, I've supported our Department of Defense in the U.S. my entire career. But the People's Liberation Army can look at this understanding that if someday it has to fight a war fight against the U.S. in the Indo-Pacific, you can be assured that it's also looking at its options in terms of its access, its military relations, its position through commercial presence and other things throughout the hemisphere. So how could it use Latin America to disrupt and to challenge the United States, perhaps putting the homeland at risk throughout Latin America in the event that it had to fight that war fight in the Indo-Pacific?
Right, so obviously the US really needs to monitor the growing PRC engagement in Latin America. And I would say specifically at the start here, in Peru, as we know at this moment, there are quite immense projects taking place.
Yes, absolutely. And it's interesting to see just the level of penetration across all sectors, which is really representative of what China is doing in each country in different ways, according to the resource endowments and according to the particular type of regime that they have. But what you see in Peru is China, because Peru sits on the Pacific, has been involved in a number of sectors for quite a long time. It's been involved in the oil sector, for example, since about 1993 when it got involved in Talara. And in 2013, it greatly expanded that when it acquired acquired the assets in Peru of Petrobras. It's been involved in a significant way in the mining sector, especially copper and iron for quite some time. A number of very large mining projects, for example, a China Minmetals project called Las Bambas, which has had any number of problems. Another project by China Aluminum Corporation in a place called Toro. Some smaller but also important projects. For example, a project by a company by the name of Xinjiao in Pampa de Pongo. There's another project in Cajamarca, etc. There's even some Chinese interest in lithium, although right now the only lithium that's being developed in Puno is in the hands of a small Italian company. But in addition to that, you have, for example, a broad Chinese presence in the electricity sector, largely through acquisitions, especially companies affiliated with the Chinese giant China Three Gorges. They actually now own the rights for distribution of virtually every place in the greater Lima area, the really central hub of the country. But also you have Chinese companies that are involved in a number of other projects around the country. The project by the name of Chagya, which is a hydroelectric facility that they operate, another by the name of San Gaban. And then, of course, in the digital sector, like other places, Chinese involvement is broad and very significant. So companies such as not only Huawei has been there for quite some time, since I believe 1997, in 3G, 4G, now some 5G projects, but also other companies like Xiaomi and Oppo and even a little Vietnamese company called Vitel gets most of their equipment from the Chinese. And then there are other areas. For example, the Chinese company Hikvision is a big player in surveillance systems in the country. You have the Chinese company Didi Chuxing, which is very important in the rideshare market, competing with Uber, just to name a few. And so you have really a multidimensional presence. Now, clearly the big thing that everyone is talking about right now with respect to the upcoming APEC summit, and this will actually be the third summit in recent years that Peru is hosting, and this will be the first time that Xi Jinping returns to Latin America since before the COVID virus. But in 2019, a major Chinese logistic giant, Costco, purchased a 60% interest in what was then a sleepy little deepwater port operation by the name of Chancay from a local company, Volcan. They are in the process of putting about $3 billion into this to transform it into really will be the biggest port operation in the entire Pacific coast of Latin America. It's going to transform the port logistics of getting across the Pacific with those big ships and everything that's tied to it in terms of the local port operations and access. But of course, that's also raised some significant concerns for the United States in the security domain because of the prospect of how that port could be used to receive and refuel Navy warships during a possible conflict. But that project, at least the first stages of that project, the intention is to launch that when Xi Jinping is there at the APEC summit, really as a symbol of Peru's position as the gateway to the Pacific in China, although Chile would have a different way of looking at that claim. But that key port and everything that could be connected to it, including a rail project, these were some of the things that when just a couple of months ago, Dina Boluarte, the president, went to China, these were some of the things that she discussed.
Yes, now President Boluarte was in China from June 25th to 29th. So this was a state visit. It's not a high-ranking event. And this port in Chancay, from what I understand, is the Peruvians changed the rules to permit a 15-berth deepwater mega port. This is no small undertaking. And as you briefly mentioned, the potential of a railway connecting to this port. So this and what I've heard from that is that the railway could extend all the way across Peru to neighboring countries. So my follow-up to this is, where does Brazil sit in all this? Because anything that happens with China, of course, President Lula, somewhere along that chain is connected.
That's a great question. And I want to first jump on something very important that you said, which was the way in which the negotiation was conducted. And I think it really illustrates how China often, with predatory practices in conjunction with non-transparent contracts with locals who may not have fully the capability to assess the risk or the details, oftentimes uses that to secure benefit, both strategic benefit and commercial benefit for itself. And I remember from the very beginning when you had the the buyout of the Volcan interests back in 2019 that I talked with my Peruvian colleagues, and they all assured me, no, under Peruvian law, you cannot operate a port as a private concession and restrict who gets in and out. This will be, under the Peruvian Port Authority, APN, something that will be operated as a public port. So even though maybe it'll compete a little bit with the existing port in Callao, it will certainly not be operated exclusively for Chinese advantage. So what we found in the recent months is that when the details of the contract got looked at, it turns out that after all, COSCO did negotiate a deal where they can say who comes in and out and how the port gets run, basically as a private concession, which means that they're in an enormously important position to be able to privilege, their own companies, Chinese mining companies, Chinese companies, which will have a significant cost advantage being able to do these trans-Pacific routes directly through Callao as opposed to through other ports. Now, when this came to light, a somewhat embarrassed Boullarte administration then said, well, APN didn't know what they were actually doing. They didn't have the legal authority to do this. And so we need to annul this, to which COSCO basically said, no. We didn't start investing, already over $1 billion with the expectation that we wouldn't have this exclusive access. And so it was going to go to arbitration under the clauses of the investment agreement that they set up. But then as Boullarte looked at everything that was at stake, in my judgment, going to China, having this big rollout of, the Xi Jinping visit and the APEC summit and the launching of the port and how that would showcase Peru and a whole other series of things that will be negotiated, with respect to a deal possibly with China Railway Road for a connection from the port to other places, possibly the construction of a electric car factory by BYD in the country someplace, actually a second port by a company by the name of Xinjiao that we mentioned before in Ica. When she looked at everything that was at stake and realized, like so many other countries realized, better to just let the Chinese have their way on this thing rather than take the risk of losing all of these benefits. And so basically they folded. Peru literally put a rule through Congress changing Peruvian law to give COSCO these advantages that no other company operating out of Peru's ports in history has had. And so to me, that kind of combination of non-transparent contracts and being outmaneuvered, that is so symbolic of how China has achieved things throughout the region. Now, with respect to Brazil, again, a very important point that historically, just about a half of all of Chinese investment in South America has gone to Brazil. It's been a huge recipient of investment. Brazil, a significant portion, of course, of their soy goes to China. A significant portion of their iron exports go to China. Increasingly, agricultural exports at a higher value-added point, such as beef and pork, are also going to China. So that's created a lot of leverage and indeed a big competition of who realizes that benefit. And so, for example, instead of some of the traditional international agro-logistics organizations like ADM and Dreyfus and Bunge, you've seen little by little companies like the big Chinese purchaser, COFCO, China Oilseeds and Foodstuffs Corporation, kind of edging into that market. The same thing with who realizes the value added for iron exports across the ocean to China, increasingly Chinese companies and not Vale. But in the Brazilian case, again, it's a very wide-ranging situation where you have again significant penetration in the telecommunications sector with cloud computing services. You have Chinese companies like Alibaba with respect to business commerce. You have the rideshare company we mentioned before, Didi, which also has a big role in Brazil right now. You have some port contracts, especially in Sao Luis, a major project which would give access to the soy industry as well as another major project in the Paraguaná Peninsula. So really, as you go across the board, I mean, the Chinese have a relationship with Brazil in space with respect to a program called Cybers. And it's interesting that although under previous governments, there had been a reluctance to do military-to-military collaboration, when Lula first came back in, somewhat more radicalized after his short time in jail before the presidency, he came back in really opening the doors to China in ways that you hadn't seen before. And so it was interesting to see that the the number two person basically for propaganda of the Chinese Navy, took a big delegation over to visit Lula right after he came into office. And as I understand it, there are already some military to military things going on. And so this will all probably come to light, as you mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, when Lula not only will be there for the APEC summit in Lima, which is itself relatively symbolic because as you can look at a map and see that Brazil is not part of the Asia Pacific. It is an invited company. But the other big stop for Xi Jinping after Lima will be going to Brazil for the G20, which Brazil will be hosting. And so what we can expect is that, although China already very strong as a partner in Brazil, we will be seeing a lot of other big deals, possibly even that railway connecting Peru to Brazil that you talked about, among other things. And so it's going to, I think, create quite a bit of a stir that advance in the relationship with China, Brazil, as well as China with Peru.
I mean, I see this as it's just this vast blanket coverage by China as an effort to seek to dominate global value chains, and it comes back to that first point you made, as China wants its own economic benefits and beyond. And I have to ask because of the tensions taking place over in the Far East, where does Taiwan fit into this? Because we mentioned the few countries in the region that still recognize Taiwan, but where does it fit in?
That's a great question. So first of all, symbolically within Chinese politics itself, although Taiwan historically has never actually been a part of the PRC, it is really symbolic of the reassertion by China under a communist control of the legacy of territories controlled by various Chinese dynasties and empires. And so in many ways, to bring Taiwan under the fold, especially for Xi Jinping now in his unprecedented third period in office, will be symbolic of the restoration, getting past what the Chinese refer to as the period of humiliation, which goes back to the taking a territory and the loss of military conflicts through the opium wars in previous century. But what you see is that there was a period in which the previous more PRC friendly party in Taiwan, the Kuomintang or KMT, was in power from 2008 to 2016. There was an attempt to try to negotiate a deal where Taiwan would come more under political control. With the return of the more hawkish, more PRC skeptical party in Taiwan, the DPP, in 2016, you began to see a resumption of the efforts to try to convince individual countries that recognize Taiwan to switch. And so when that new fight began in Africa with Gambia and Sao Tome and Principe in 2016, but then it shifted into Latin America with the PRC going after first Panama and then, of course, the Dominican Republic in El Salvador, and of course, more recently, the flips by Nicaragua and Honduras. But in addition to that, you see, of course, continued efforts against Paraguay, especially trying to leverage working through the agricultural producers, a lot of whispering in the ears of beef producers of how much more beef they could sell if only they flipped recognition. Although I was in Paraguay just a couple of months ago and had the opportunity to talk to President Santiago Peña, who is a very, very impressive person, and I think very committed to staying with Taiwan. But the pressure is still there. Same thing in Guatemala, where you see that President Bernardo Arévalo's attempts to try to do business with the PRC and stay with Taiwan. The PRC doesn't want to let that happen. Indeed, they actually subtly, as the Chinese are often try to do, they subtly shut down a significant export by Guatemala of various different types of nuts to the PRC, really as a message to say that if you don't flip, not only are you not going to get greater access to the PRC market, but you could lose the access that you already have. And also in the citizenship for investment countries in the Caribbean, so especially St. Vincent, St. Lucia, among others, and St. Kitts, you see real pressure on those people who are essentially ethnic Chinese investors who have actually gone to those places to try to take their money out of the PRC and essentially escape. But there is a price for being let alone by the long arm of the communist regime. And one of those things might be to get their support to try to flip recognition by those small island countries. And so those pressures are going on across the board. And there's a couple different risks. Number one is that it is a way of dramatically expanding Chinese presence, because every flip that we've seen, you see that there is a corresponding signing of a number of non-transparent MOUs, oftentimes an attempt to negotiate an FTA, as occurred with Nicaragua and Honduras, and is now underway with El Salvador, and has previously occurred with Costa Rica. But that combination, it opens up the market to Chinese companies in infrastructure projects, in other things. Usually a Confucius Institute is established. Usually there are training programs for the new authorities on how to do business with the Chinese state, but it usually involves how to import products from the Chinese state, et cetera, et cetera. But that combination of things really sets up a dramatic expansion of influence. And from an Indo-Pacific standpoint, the big risk as well is that as the number of countries which recognize Taiwan go to zero, again, we're already down to 12, the temptation of Taiwan, of the PRC, which is already very aggressive in the South and East China Sea and elsewhere, to say, okay, the country is now isolated. We now feel comfortable doing surrounding the island, doing an embargo, doing even possibly a military invasion. As the number of recognizers of Taiwan run out, the risks of PRC coercive action in the Indo-Pacific and the possible war that could accompany that goes up. So there is a lot at stake in both this hemisphere and in the Indo-Pacific, and it is a game that the Chinese are trying to press very aggressively, and especially with the new hardliner, or at least more pro-Taiwan, more PRC skeptical DPP government of Tony Lai that was literally just elected a couple months ago.
It is a concern, definitely, this type of pressure, and that the PRC is using these commercial tools in very, I would say, countries with precarious economies they're creating a global economic order that functions to China's benefit. And I ask now, is with the US absence in the region, I mean, the US obviously is here, but they're not building railways, they're not building ports. What can we expect in coming months? We've got the November 5th elections and possible either Trump or Harris presidency. What can we expect in the relationship US to the global South, to Latin America, and China, obviously, I would say, sort of digging an elbow in this sphere of influence for the United States?
That's a great question. So first of all, important to recognize that there was a bit of a shift in momentum with the COVID-19 virus. And so even though we heard a lot about China advancing through diplomacy with respect to personal protective equipment, masks, and then of course, their marginally effective vaccines, but there also was a shutdown of progress on a lot of major infrastructure projects because the PRC diplomats and SOE representatives really couldn't travel to the region, and the region really wasn't in a position to be able to launch these new projects. And so there was an illusion of, less of those big projects that we saw before, less announced big policy bank investments, et cetera. In 2023, you actually saw a significant return of Latin America to China. I believe over 8 or more Latin American leaders went to China for a variety of different visits. Nicolas Maduro went actually at the end of 2022. Miguel Diaz-Canel of Cuba went. Xiomara Castro went. Of course, Lula from Brazil went. Gabriel Boric of Chile went, et cetera, et cetera. This year, you had Chan Santoki of Suriname who traveled. The previous year, Irfan Ali traveled. And of course, this year is the year that, as we've mentioned, Xi Jinping comes back to Latin America in a big way with this major event in November in Peru and in Brazil, and maybe Jamaica. You heard it here first. That's not definite yet. But in addition to that, what you see in terms of the substance behind that is, on the one hand, because of some of the economic problems in China, of course, the difficulties in the private property sector with Evergrande and the collapse of some of those real estate deals, and also the attention to corruption that was associated with it. Those big projects, especially those that didn't make a lot of economic sense, are not coming quite as fast and furious as before. But what you're seeing is a continued advance in privileged sectors like electricity, as well as the digital sectors. And so a lot of cloud computing investments, a lot of 5G pilot projects, a lot of electricity sector investments, especially in key markets such as Peru and in Brazil and elsewhere. A lot of penetration by Chinese companies in the electricity sector, BYD, for example, with respect to buses and in electric cars, but also Chinese solar panel projects and hydro projects and wind projects, et cetera, et cetera. Now, On the U.S. side, of course, as this has been watched, and we've sadly been a little bit constrained by the domestic politics and polemics to talk a lot about China, but really not advance a lot of some of the significant spending that we would have liked to do with respect to, for example, what was once called a Build Back Better World, which would have had at least a certain amount of new infrastructure spending that could have been channeled to the region. One of the difficulties, of course, also has been that there are not a lot of U.S. companies that, with things like the Corrupt Practices Act, have been very enthusiastic about investing in the region. It's very difficult even for friendly companies from Japan and South Korea to really compete against Huawei, given that they already have the underlying infrastructure and a lot of advantages with respect to price. So I think what you can look for is a continued focus on China, trying to provide alternatives, messaging, trying to insist on transparency of the projects that are occurring, trying to put more data out on some of the risks associated with not going in from a perspective of strong institutions for contract evaluation and supervision and things like that, and frankly an offer by the U.S. to help. I think there's also some efforts to provide alternatives through the private sector, such as, for example, the Development Finance Corporation, as well as even USAID has one piece of that organization, which is looking at how can it provide market-friendly, pro-democratic alternatives while at the same time also doing good, which is what USAID has already done. So again, I think lots of activity, although I think we'll have to wait and see till November, really what direction some of those activities on the side of U.S. response actually go in.
A lot of speculation, a lot of academia, but we have to wait and see is really what you mentioned the U.S. and obviously pro-democracy behavior, obviously. The concern to many countries and the concern to people watching the region is this PRC threat to democracy. And you mentioned the way that they leveraged their power at the port of Chancay, and it has been done elsewhere as well. I mean, we have a long history of China economically, I would say, underwriting illiberal actors. And we can go through several of our neighbors here in South America, obviously Chavez in Venezuela, leading to Nicolas Maduro there. Perhaps we could focus 1 second on Venezuela because it's very topical. At what stage are we right now with, let's say, the Chinese investments and influence in Venezuela? Because we know that there are huge loans to be repaid by Venezuela, and one wonders if they can do it.
No, it's a great question. What I sense is the PRC is playing a wait-and-see game, although it continues to do a certain amount of work in Venezuela, and especially now with the apparent success that Maduro has had in robbing the election of this past July 28th. There's signals that the PRC, as well as Russia and Iran and others, are ramping up their game once again. But important to recognize that historically, first, the PRC has been very good at structuring its loans and contracts in Venezuela, as well as in Ecuador under Rafael Correa and in other places, in ways that make sure it gets paid, even while nobody else was getting paid. So if you look at the record, it's interesting to note that the loans that were taken out to China, the regime in Venezuela continued to pay on those up until 2020, when they briefly suspended the principal payments, even though they continued interest payments. And you say, well, why was that, or how did that happen? Well, essentially what they did, this is something that they started doing back in the late 1990s in Africa and places like Angola and Mozambique. They then applied the model to Venezuela and then later Ecuador and elsewhere, basically securitizing their loans through parallel contracts for commodities. So in the Venezuelan case, what they set up was, on the one hand, China National Petroleum Corporation had contracts to operate or literally cooperate with PDVSA, the oil company, oil fields. They would then extract oil at a certain rate, and then when they took delivery on that oil that was pumped out of the ground literally by China and then delivered to a CNPC subsidiary essentially at the port there in Puerto Cabello and in other places, they would then give a corresponding credit for those oil deliveries in an account in renminbi in China. That account, think of it as like a company store or company credit card. And so as the Venezuelans had set up a couple big funds, one was called the Heavy Investment Fund, one was called the Broad Reach and Long Range Fund. So in total, there are about $64 billion through approximately 2015 that were channeled through these funds. But the interesting thing about those funds is that you had to use Chinese companies, you could import Chinese products. But at the end of the day, they were basically running up the credit card bill. And then as they pumped out oil, they were basically paying down or making monthly payments, if you will, against those credit card bills. And so whereas Venezuela could make sovereign decisions to say, okay, we're not going to pay this bond. We're not going to pay even the Russians. They stopped paying during a certain point in time. They stopped paying Schlumberger and Halliburton. They didn't pay court cases against them, but they kept paying the Chinese because the only way to stop paying the Chinese would have been to physically go in and prevent from pumping oil. And if they had done that, they would have actually undermined their own economy. So on the one hand, the Chinese are and have been much better in controlling risk than we often realize. We oftentimes think, well, the Chinese are, their SOEs are stupid or naive, with the risks of these type of regimes. But it goes a little bit deeper than that. But the other piece is that the Chinese also controlled risk during the sanctions period. So I worked, of course, under Secretary Pompeo during the Trump administration from 2019 to 2020. And what I saw as we dealt with Venezuela then is that as we ratchet up the sanctions, CNPC, for example, had a lot of exposure with respect to its other international operations. And so first, companies like CNPC stopped directly taking oil deliveries. And instead, what they did is they started shifting to, doing ship-to-ship transfers off of the coast of Malaysia to hide the Venezuelan origins of the oil. In some cases, they actually changed the characteristics of the oil so it looked like a different type of oil than what they had taken out of Venezuela. Then later, you basically had profiteers who were paid in cryptocurrency. This was a very lucrative operation that people like Tariq al-Assami in Venezuela ran again until they were ratcheted in. And then the other thing that they did, which is interesting, is that CNPC started getting out of that business. And you had a Chinese military company called CADIC, which began leasing tankers because as a military company, they were much less exposed to U.S. sanctions because they didn't do a lot of business with the United States on international markets. And so I think what you see now is that the Chinese are beginning to have those talks about resuming access. They never left Venezuela. They just have been very cautious. And I think you're beginning to see that they are now interested in resuming some of those activities that, again, has long been key to sustaining the Maduro regime, as with other non-democratic regimes in the region.
And you mentioned Correa in Ecuador, of course, and then we need to move on to lithium in Bolivia. Obviously, the huge seat of lithium, Evo Morales, and in that period, and a possibility, albeit shaky at this moment, that Evo Morales returns in Bolivia, potentially in 2025. And I think a quote, if we keep moving down the continent, a quote from Javier Milei in Argentina that he would never make pacts with communists. But clearly, there are all sorts of agreements that have been done with the Peronists in Argentina. And this relationship is broad and substantial. But you have someone as outspoken as Javier Milei. What is going on there in this complexity of a relationship with Argentina?
Sure. And you make a number of great points. And number one is the way in which China has been successful in adapting its approach to doing business with relatively conservative, well-institutionalized regimes, such as, for example, Chile, both under Piñera and now under Gabriel Boric, as well as under a variety of different left-oriented regimes, which they've adopted different strategies for. The point about lithium is also important because it's one of a number of strategically key resources. And the lithium story with China in Latin America actually extends beyond Bolivia. You actually see that, for example, in the north of Chile, China went after lithium in one way, which was to go for a 25% stake in one of the big lithium operations. There, a company called Tiangqi getting that stake with the activities of Sociedad Química de Minera, one of the Leroux companies. At the same time, in Argentina, it went after it in a different way. In Argentina, the lithium deals are primarily made at the provincial level. And so you had something like 8 different major Chinese lithium deals dealing in places like Jujuy, where they've actually done pretty well. As a matter of fact, probably the most lithium that's going to be exported will be exported in the early years from Latin America from Argentina, ironically under Javier Milei, because Javier Milei, again, is making deals at the national level, but as a libertarian, his general posture is that, let companies and let others do what they want to do. And so there's not yet been signs that there's pressure from Milei not to allow the provinces or individual companies in Argentina to do things. The interesting thing about Bolivia is that although there's been a lot of talk, Bolivia, whether under Evo Morales or now under Luis Arce, who seems to be equally willing to deal with the Chinese. There's 2 big Chinese consortium, one a battery manufacturer called CATL and another a CITIC company, CITIC Gawan, which they've signed major deals with, as well as Russia's Uranium One. The problem is, however, that the conditions in terms of the new lithium organization, YLB, and the things that they want, as well as the quality of the lithium itself, just like other big projects like the iron project in El Mutun that basically frustrated the Indian company Jindal for a number of years. And what you see is a lot of generous declarations of access, but a lot of kind of thrashing around on the Bolivian side to actually get those lithium projects with China off of the ground. And so, ironically, probably the most generous access in the biggest fields are in Bolivia, but that's probably not going forward as, again, that infighting between Arce and Morales continues as we approach 2025. In the case of Chile, as we mentioned before, the irony in Chile was that concerns over the impact on water tables. And of course, Gabriel Boric's government is very concerned about environmental impacts. And so you actually find that, number one, they haven't been able to take the projects forward because of environmental concerns. And number two, Chile wants, just like with copper, to basically have state control over its own lithium. And so the big consortium in which China has a part just basically signed a deal with the Chilean government, which will allow the government to become a partner. And so the Chinese are in a process of vociferously protesting what has just happened. So it looks like the Chilean project's a little bit stuck now too. We often also forget that if we look just to the south of the United States, in Mexico, in the Sonora Desert, there's another big lithium field called Bacanora, which the Chinese thought that they were buying into until nationalist-oriented Andrés Manuel López Obrador said, we want to nationalize the sector, to which, of course, the Chinese company Ganfeng, which had bought into that, said, well, we bought this. We thought we were going to develop it. We're not going to go along with you. And so there was a big fight that was taken away from them. And so what's interesting is you see that the Chinese have been very aggressive across the region with companies on both the right and left pursuing the lithium. Oftentimes they like to tie the location of a battery factory or a car factory to having access to the lithium. But what you see is in different ways, it hasn't been a cakewalk. They've been very, very frustrated. And then, of course, just to end the point, what you talked about the Javier Milei, what you also find is that across the region, the Chinese have had difficulties with governments that shift from the left to the right. So Javier Milei, this isn't the first time that there's been problems with a China skeptical government. We can remember that Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, when he was in office, he talked very badly about the Chinese as well. And yet he appointed in his Ministry of Finance the person who'd previously been the head of the China-Brazil Business Council. And a lot of business continued to be done despite that rhetoric, especially at the state and subnational level. And so it's interesting in Argentina right now that although the big state-to-state deals, the military contracts, for example, Argentina's purchase of Chinese FC-1 fighters has not occurred. There's been some pushback on, for example, the Chinese access to the big space station in Neuquén. But business with Javier Milei, despite his rhetoric with China, continues to go on. And that seems to be the pattern that you find in a lot of different places. Whatever happens politically, the Chinese operating below the scene kind of weave their webs of influence and continue to have that access in the business domain.
China incredibly savvy in the business world. That the mention of the lithium in northern Mexico, and of course then China withdrawing from that, or sort of under AMLO's influence. How do we see President Sheinbaum with regards to these investments?
That's a great question. To me, Mexico is and will continue to be a big irony with respect to China and a number of other issues. To me, you will probably see essentially technically better governance, but things that will expand the presence of China significantly in ways that will probably cause significant conflicts and make the U.S. profoundly uncomfortable. So one thing that's important to recognize is before Claudia Sheinbaum was elected, the Chinese were positioned in a number of key sectors relevant to Sheinbaum's own agenda. And so, as we mentioned before, they had positioned themselves with respect to lithium and Vaca Muerta. They had positioned themselves with respect to clean energy, which is a big issue for Sheinbaum, with the purchase of a company called Zuma, which has a lot of wind and solar and other holdings. They had positioned themselves in the infrastructure sector with respect to work on Tren Maya with CCCC in the south of the country, just to name a couple others. And of course, also ironically under this concept of decoupling, which is the idea that companies don't want to be sourcing out of China because they worry that they're going to lose access to the U.S. market, among others. And so they've been moving to Mexico in the maquiladora sector, especially in states like Nuevo León. But the irony was that one of the biggest sources of investment under this decoupling or nearshoring in Mexico in the past 2 or 3 years, despite some of AMLO's business unfriendly policies, has been the Chinese, because Chinese companies desperately wanted to reinvent themselves as Mexican companies to preserve access to the U.S. market under USMCA. And so as Sheinbaum comes in, a couple of things, it's a bit of a perfect storm. Number one is we've seen there was the election of an unprecedented number of Morena, the ruling party deputies, basically achieving a near 2/3 and with a few defections, a 2/3 majority in both the Chamber of Deputies and the Senate. And the consequence of that not only is judicial reform, but also I think we'll be seeing is the possibility of changing the law or changing the Constitution to push forward on infrastructure projects in other areas in which decisions by the government were previously frustrated. And so you'll have Sheinbaum coming in with unprecedented legislative authority to work with whoever she wants, but especially the Chinese on things like infrastructure projects. Sheinbaum has also been very attentive to nearshoring projects. She's been a big promoter of investing in, essentially the infrastructure that attracts people in, again, patio space with the electricity and water and roads and things that goes with that. And so the irony will be that Sheinbaum will have more authority to attract more Chinese companies in. Companies like BYD with their hybrid truck facility that they're talking about, among others. She will have more incentive to try to build up clean energy projects where she'll find that the Chinese already have a dominant position through Zuma and through Vaca Muerta, which she may think about wanting to renegotiate their relationship with the Mexican Electricity Authority, CFE. You will find that in a number of other areas, for example, when we talk about infrastructure, where again, thanks to that legislative change, she will have more authority to make federal decisions on infrastructure. One of the big coming infrastructure expansions in Mexico that's talked about a little bit, but probably not enough, is what's called the Transseismic Project, essentially a connection across the thinnest part of Mexico from basically just south of Veracruz on the Atlantic side to Port Salinas Cruz on the Pacific side. And there's already a train line there, but the development of that port infrastructure, as well as patio space and other logistics operations all throughout that. And again, the Chinese are already there with Tren Maya, a little bit to the south. And so it's likely that you'll see a Chinese expansion there. And in the middle of all of that, of course, the trade agreement, MCA, previously NAFTA, will be up for renegotiation beginning next year and finalized in 2026. And so just as you're seeing an expansion of Chinese companies in nearshoring, in the electricity sector, in lithium, in other projects, the U.S. increasingly uncomfortable with the Chinese expansion so close to the U.S. border and with access to U.S. supply chains will be giving a very hard relook at its key trade deal with Mexico. So probably, ironically, technocratically good governance, environmentally friendly governance, something that will expand China's influence and probably in the process tee up a pretty major trade conflict with the United States in the coming years.
Absolutely fascinating. And that's a lot of looking forwards there. A lot of questions remain. And as I said previously, speculation about where we go and looking ahead at China's investment, which won't, as you've very completely explained, it will not ebb. It will continue underway unless the unthinkable happens. But at the same time, it really is something that needs to be more in the news and needs to be further reported, because just this 40-minute conversation with you has gone so very deeply into projects that I know that a lot of our listeners will never have heard of before, but are of incredible importance. So let me take this moment to say thank you so much to Dr. Evan Ellis, who is the Latin American Research Professor at the U.S. Army War College in the United States. It has been a truly incredible conversation with you today.
Pleasure's mine. Thank you very much.
This has been the Latin News Podcast. I've been your host, Richard McCall, here in Bogota, Colombia. We'll be back in a fortnight's time discussing more relevant stories from the region. Thank you for listening, and bye-bye.